Today, we're very happy to have two special guests. The UK Consul General, Miss Corinne Wilson, who will give a few introductory remarks, and William Horsley, who is one of us as a former BBC correspondent, and who is currently the International Director of the Centre for Freedom of the Media at the University of Sheffield. Since Miss Wilson is going to do the introduction about William's work, I'll pass the mic directly to her, and I ask you to welcome her. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's really great to see you all here. Thank you for coming. I'm really delighted on behalf of the British government to be supporting this and to have William Horsley here. I shall tell you a little bit about William later. But really, I just wanted to first of all say a few words on the freedom of the media in Hong Kong. Well, as we know, freedom of media, freedom of expression are integral to human rights, whether economic, social, cultural, political. I note what Lord Neuberger said to you all when he was here in August, and he gave an excellent speech to the Foreign Correspondents Club. And Lord Neuberger said that the media also plays a vital function in relation to the judiciary and to the rule of law. Which is absolutely true. Also really important in terms of holding the executive arm of government to account. So all these, the case is clearer. I think that's why we're all here today. That's why all of you are doing the jobs you're doing. These freedoms and those who embody them, you in other words, are fundamental to a modern civilized democratic society. Can you not hear me?
Yeah, we are. No, that's fine.
Right. Did anybody hear anything I just said? Do I need to repeat it all? Sorry? Oh, the light. Oh. I see. The TV. Yeah, okay. So we need to nurture and treasure these freedoms, and indeed you as well, I guess, as you embody them. Well, in Hong Kong, you may all be familiar with Article 27 of the Basic Law, and that, of course, guarantees these freedoms I've been talking about. It is the heart of one country, two systems. Now, Hong Kong has traditionally been home to a very vibrant and outspoken free media, whether print, broadcast or online. But regrettably, it's fair to say that legislation is not enough. It's not enough to have Article 27 of the Basic Law. The practice needs to be strong as well to protect these rights. And unfortunately, confidence in freedom of the press is declining here in Hong Kong, as you all know, and has been well documented in international surveys and international reports. There's a very, one of Freedom House's excellent reports describes a gradual transformation in the media ecology here in Hong Kong. And I suppose, a particular challenge for Hong Kong is, let's be honest about it, one country, two systems, a very different system within the framework of the People's Republic of China, where there's a rather different situation in place for the journalists. Well, we are very conscious of this. We cover the threats, the challenges, the situation on freedom of media in our 6-monthly report. And to borrow again a phrase from Lord Neuberger, he said, it was in a different context, but I think it's still applicable, I am no more in favour of complacency than I am of alarmism, but I enthusiastically subscribe to the notion that the price of liberty, and in this case I'm talking about press freedom, is eternal vigilance. So we very much want to support you in being eternally vigilant, but not just being vigilant, crucially, not just wringing our hands about what may be happening, but actually looking at practical ways and about what lessons we can look at in terms of international experience, which is where I come on to our speaker, because in William you have somebody with an extraordinary range of experience who's worked for over 30 years as an international foreign correspondent for the BBC in Asia and in Europe. And William is a writer on international affairs and an active advocate for press freedom. Two particular things I want to highlight: his work as international director of the Centre for Freedom of the Media at the University of Sheffield, which is a partner of UNESCO in implementing the UN Action Plan on safety of journalists. And William is also the Vice President and Media Freedom Representative of the Association of European Journalists. And Europe, for these purposes, I gather, includes some challenging places such as Russia. So not just the EU, in case any of you were wondering. And William has written several reports on the state of media freedom in Europe for the Parliamentary Assembly, and he's actually just given some of his excellent copies of his excellent guidebook on the safety of journalists to the FCC. So those will be available soon in your library, I gather. William's also working with UNESCO and Council of Europe to strengthen legal and political protections for journalists worldwide. So a wealth of experience in exactly the issues that really matter to Hong Kong as well. So that's enough from me. You've come to hear William, I gather, I hope. Please.
Glass. Perhaps I could just have a little water. Thank you very much.
No,
a glass of water.
Glass.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad and honoured to be here with you in the Foreign Correspondents Club of Hong Kong, a venerable home for journalists and journalism. Many thanks to my hosts, to the British Consulate, and to yourselves at the FCC for dragging me out of cool Kensington to a very sultry Hong Kong. I'm relieved to find that the pace of life here in Hong Kong puts London in the slow lane, so that's impressive. And I do recall that one of the last times I was here was actually just after June the 4th of 1989, and I was based in Japan as the BBC correspondent, and I was sent hurriedly to Beijing for the aftermath of Tiananmen. And I saw that night in Hong Kong the streets overflowing with Hong Kongers who were showing their alarm, dismay, protest at the events in Beijing, and it was very impressive. And last year we saw again the sense of civic pride and respect for the idea of democracy and universal suffrage, which I think really is a historic landmark in the history of Asia, to see the people of Hong Kong showing that understanding and that kind of commitment. My theme today, I submit, is not just for journalists and not just for governments, but this theme of press freedom under multiple attack is one of the determining issues of our age, and it does involve everybody, which is one reason why it is very heartening to see the society as a whole in a place like Hong Kong aware and making priority of this issue. From my work, as Caroline has mentioned, with a lot of intergovernmental organizations, sometimes advising governments from Nepal to Austria in various ways, it's very obvious that, from Russia to the Middle East, from Hong Kong to the UK, journalists are under threat in new ways and more severe ways, from arrest and imprisonment, harassment, intimidation from government authorities, often from militant groups, other criminal groups. And the odds have shifted against press freedom as states have armed themselves with extra powers in the name of fighting terrorism, and sometimes from sheer nationalism. Nobody doubts the real threat of a disastrous attack. We've seen them in London, in Paris, in Madrid, in Washington, in many places in Asia too. But take the lesson of US Senator Ron Wyden, who has written about this recently, because the Senate, of course, has acted recently against the powers which were assumed by the NSA in America without the public knowing and without lawfulness, saying that it is appropriate to keep secrets for the sake of national security, but officials too often keep secrets for their own security. And recall that the events, that the activities that the US was involved with after 9/11, the secret renditions, the use of torture, and so on, were among the things that have been covered up by the power which is regarded as the leader of the Western world. So I was extremely impressed reading the annual report of the Hong Kong Journalists Association for last year, bearing in mind the very special political circumstances of this place, but in many ways the violations and the concerns that were outlined there, from the intimidations and actual attacks against journalists, sometimes in the street, the vicious attack against Kevin Lau, the administrative harassment, the question of the allocation of broadcasting licenses, allegedly partisan, and above all, the failure to investigate and prosecute the crimes, the sentence that none of these serious attacks has yet been properly resolved. All these things ring a very loud bell with me, because monitoring the situation in places like Russia and Mexico, Pakistan, these are the things, not just the physical attacks, but it is the responses of the authority, or the lack of responses, the lack of an independent regulatory system which keeps partisan political and business interests at bay, that is decisive. One more thing, in the big picture, in terms of journalists covering international affairs, particularly conflict and crisis, a quote from Christian Amanpour, who is actually now a UNESCO ambassador for press freedom, about the biggest change in her 30-year career as an international journalist, saying, whether it's in Syria, Libya, Russia, or the Philippines, journalists are now being targeted. They were once regarded as a bit like the Red Cross, as neutral players and above the fray. They're now trying to shut us up. Look at the statistics. They're killing the messenger. And the statistics show something like close to 700 deaths in 7 years of journalists, and of course many times more that of abductions and injuries, and 200 or more journalists in jail every year the last 3 years in different parts of the world. We're all aware of the situation in Syria, with ISIS capturing and murdering James Foley and other journalists for their propaganda purposes. What this has done is to create no-go areas, effectively, for international media in quite a number of parts of the world. A couple of years ago, I was working with the BBC, and the result was a statement by all the major international public broadcasters, BBC, Deutsche Welle, VOA, and the others, which said effectively to the UN and the rest of the world, the increased physical risks to our people around the world and our local staff are so severe that we are now unable to carry out our task, which is to bring reliable and accurate information to a global audience from everywhere in the world. So it's a turning point. And that, just for a moment, I'll say why that situation was the trigger which drove me, after many years of the BBC, to move into this area of trying to protect safety of journalists and press freedom through a multi-stakeholder approach, working with the University of Sheffield in an interdisciplinary centre with not only the journalism studies department, but also the international law people, and becoming partners of the UN, particularly UNESCO, working with big media to make them more aware of the necessary role they have in highlighting these issues and in holding governments to account. To the phrase from the head of BBC Global News was to put the issue of safety of journalists and particularly impunity, the failure to investigate and punish attacks on journalists, up the political agenda. And the remarkable thing is it has soared up the political agenda. It was actually, dare I say it, a small group of journalists, media, academics and others in Britain who proposed in 2010 that the UN should form an interagency initiative on the safety of journalists. It was just to have a meeting. 2 years later, that initiative became the UN Action Plan on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity, with support from the British government, European governments, and eventually, after a lot of diplomatic hoopla and a lot of attempts at evasion by a number of countries which call themselves democratic, or at least partners of Western countries, like Pakistan, like India, like Brazil, it has become an interagency program with more than 100 action lines, with an intense focus on the most dangerous countries in the world, including Pakistan, Iraq and Nepal. And the watchword of the plan is that it is the role of governments, with support from media and others, to create a safe and enabling environment for journalists. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means later, but the message really is that international law is on the side of press freedom, and a number of resolutions have been passed, particularly in the UN General Assembly. December 2013 resolution on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity spells out the responsibilities of governments to put a legal framework in place for the safe and enabling environment, to instruct and control law enforcement, to train them, to ensure that they protect journalists and follow up on attacks on journalists, and the role for the journalists themselves. And indeed, protection mechanisms have been instituted. Places like Mexico, Colombia, actually particularly Colombia is a very successful one, operating in conjunction, governments working with media and NGOs, and saved hundreds of lives. And it shows that civil society, when it works with a willing government, can transform the situation for the better. Just a word on how it's come about that, as Caroline mentioned, Freedom House now says that press freedom around the world is at its lowest ebb for 10 years. How can that be with the internet, with self-publication on the internet, and so on? A couple of examples of how governments, authoritarian governments, have made use of their powers. Putin's Russia, one of the first series of actions when President Putin came to power was to take control of the media, to oust the oligarchs who had control of the commercial TV channels, and to make it serve his will, then to enact laws, including extremism laws, which make it impossible for journalists to operate independently, and then to use a range of devices, squeezing independent media like Dodged, Rain, TV News and others off the cable networks, and a variety of other means. Or take the Middle East, take the Arab Spring uprising in Egypt, where it was social media, of course, that spread the wildfire of the protests in Taksim in Cairo, and it was Vail Gornim, a Facebook who found a Facebook image of a tortured Egyptian called Khaled, and he posted it with the message, "Today they killed Khaled." He said, "If I don't act for his sake, tomorrow they will kill me. We are all Khaled." Now, several years later, we find government back in power, which monitors social media, which uses high technology exported by European countries to track down and often torture and imprison those responsible. Actually, it's Peter Greste, the Al Jazeera journalist who spent more than a year in jail in Cairo, who I think best expresses the thrust of what I want to say today. He says that he himself received extraordinary support from around the world, but thousands of other cases of mainly local journalists who are routinely attacked, jailed, disappeared, tortured or killed go unreported in the media. And that often means that the public fails to understand the essential role played by journalists in upholding democracy, and then governments get away with attacks on the press. And that's the key point: impunity, the rule of law as the casualty of the attacks on the press. One symbolic case was, in fact, two of colleagues of Florence, Radio France International, who abducted and killed by rebels in Mali on November the 2nd, 2013. They were both experienced journalists. They went to do an interview with a rebel. They were taken away in a truck, and as French troops pursued them, they were both shot dead. Now, an extraordinary legacy of that incident is that in the General Assembly resolution which I mentioned, 2nd of November is now nominated by the UN as International Day to end impunity for crimes against journalists. And one of the points about the UN action plan and all these resolutions is that this is a multi-stakeholder thing. It can't work only by the work of national governments or intergovernmental organizations. It has to be civil society and the media that draw these things to attention, that insist on holding the governments and the judiciaries to account in order to make things happen. So my point on international law is that actually, in a strange way, the argument has been won. We have the principal international treaty, which many journalists are probably unaware of, which protects their freedoms and rights, is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 19. And this has been interpreted by the UN Human Rights Committee, the top body of lawyers from around the world, in a document which is enticingly entitled General Comment 34 on Article 19, but it is really essential reading, and I find it extraordinary that news media do not train their journalists not only in physical safety and in how to comport themselves in dangerous areas, but in the international law aspects of it. Because if you don't understand that, you can't understand, you can't press not only for yourself, but for others when people like when the Al Jazeera staff are in Cairo jails, or when in Hong Kong or elsewhere, when things go wrong, you must understand these protections. And this document from the Human Rights Committee it raises the bar. It creates effectively new interpretations, new standards of government's obligations in this area, including what they call positive obligations. That's to say, it's not enough for governments only to ensure that their own officials don't do harm. Police don't beat people up. That judges don't do the will of politicians like they do with telephone justice in Russia. These are positive obligations to protect life when journalists or others are threatened, and government authorities know or should know that they're under threat. They have a positive obligation. This is particularly elaborated in the European Court of Human Rights, the Strasbourg Court, with 2 cases out of Turkey, including that of Hrant Dink, where Turkey was found in violation both for failing to protect life and also for failing to conduct an effective investigation into the killing. So police were accused and others were accused of covering up their failure. Freedom of information, the Human Rights Committee says governments should put in the public domain basically all information held by public authorities except to very limited restrictions. As I say, the UN General Assembly resolution not only outlines the detailed obligations of states, we have Human Rights Council resolution, which talks about, and this I think might be relevant for Hong Kong and others, how to ensure a prompt, effective and impartial investigation in cases of crimes, of attacks and others against journalists. Talking about protocols to train law enforcement and justice authorities so that, for example, if a journalist is attacked, then the presumption should be that there might be a link with the journalist's work, and things proceed from that starting point. So as you would have a specialist police force for financial crime, so you need for crimes in which journalists are attacked. And all too often around the world, whether it's in Turkey or Russia or anywhere else, there's the instinct of the authorities is to deny, first of all, to say this is a common crime. Often in the case of countries like Azerbaijan and indeed Turkey, you have trumped up charges of hooliganism, tax evasion, all kinds of things which cover up the fact that journalists are in jail because of what they do. So we are left with a paradox that international law has become a great deal more helpful, supportive, clear on the need for governments to uphold press freedom and protect journalists in particular because of the, first of all, their vital role in keeping public informed. Secondly, because they're exceptionally vulnerable, and when they are attacked, whole societies are deprived of the information that they need. So, probably more than halfway, but I'll now move a little bit to the UK's. You'd like me to wind down quite soon?
So that we have time to take.
Indeed. Okay. Well, several points about the UK. The UK role in championing press freedom is very important, outstanding in history. Obviously, Britain's role here in Hong Kong, the Commonwealth and so on, makes it something of a model, a replicator, and so on. UK was important part in getting the system in the UN Human Rights Council of peer review, universal periodic review, as a means of examining the record of each country in turn. Every 4 years, every country is under review. We were one of the first countries to submit to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. In other words, not just advisory, but and eventually we incorporated the European Convention into British law in the Human Rights Act. However, 2 things have recently raised questions about where the UK stands as a champion of press freedom. I should mention also the UK's Human Rights Report, most recent one, says a lot of extremely helpful things about, for example, criticising the role of the Chinese government in convicting journalists for spreading gossip and rumour, and working to support bloggers and journalists in Russia, and so on. But bearing in mind what I said about the European Convention, the European Convention has not only protected journalists, it has actually British cases brought to the Strasbourg court, which is of course a body of international law, it's not only European, have actually corrected errors in British justice, and particularly violations and repression of journalists down the years. One example is after the spycatcher scandal of the 1980s. In 1989, it was the first law which actually recognised the existence of MI5, the security service in the UK. Before then, it was completely secret. Or take the thalidomide case, the exposure by the Sunday Times of the scandal of thalidomide in the 1970s, and many others. In fact, the protection of journalist sources, the Goodwin case is another one. That's another UK case. So the present dialogue in the UK by many politicians suggesting that UK Parliament has to be supreme, that we can't be bothered with foreign judges and so on, is, I suppose, to use the diplomatic phrase, a load of baloney. And it has been quite accurately, I think, described by the former Attorney General, Dominic Grieve, as a schoolboy enterprise. Is completely incredible to suggest that the UK would be better off scrapping the Human Rights Act. So very quickly on the Snowden revelations and the issue of surveillance and so on, and what should be done. We have, you know, the situation in July the 20th, I think it was, 2013, British security agents show up at the Guardian on a Saturday afternoon. They demand that the hard drives of computer holding Snowden files are ground to dust. So they went out and they bought the necessary equipment, and it was ground to dust. We have two, and Alan Rusbridger, who's just retired as the editor of The Guardian, said quite simply that the Snowden revelations show blanket surveillance by the governments in the US and the UK may spell the end of investigative journalism. Why? Because governments, not only in places like Russia and China, but also in the West, will always find a way to find out who journalists have been talking to. This, I think this has the dimensions, frankly, of a make or break issue. It's a potential constitutional crisis in the UK, because we now have a confrontation, effectively, between the UK's commitment to rules-based system, to no arbitrary action by governments which is not covered by law, and we have an irreconcilable difference between the point of view of the heads of the security and intelligence services, who said in November 2013, Sir John Sawers, head of MI6, that the leaks have put our operations at risk. It's clear that our adversaries are rubbing their hands with glee. Al-Qaeda is lapping it up. And what I've just described, what was said by Alan Rusbridger. And the evidence from many journalists, investigative journalists, Andrew Norfolk of The Times, who exposed criminal conspiracies of various kinds in the UK, saying that since the anti-terrorism laws were strengthened, and since the Leveson inquiry into malpractices with the British press, which we haven't had time to go into, but it's worth saying that the British elements of the British press broke fundamentally the cardinal rules of journalism, which is for integrity and humanity, in the most gross way, and they lost public trust. And so we're left with this confrontational situation in the UK, where the Daily Telegraph got hold, illegally by the way, of stolen material, showing that MPs had systematically, many MPs had fiddled their expenses. They were dishonest at the taxpayer, and there was no contest from the politicians. They accepted this was wrong. Actually, it was over-reported in some ways, and some MPs were wrongly accused. But on the other hand, you then had the exposures of the phone hacking scandal and so on, which led to an extraordinary show of unity among politicians, all the major parties in the UK, to recommend legal intervention for the first time to enforce or to ensure a so-called independent regime of regulation. We can have a word about that if you want to afterwards. So I want to end with just a couple of thoughts what this means for all sides. For the media, I think I think they have to up their game. I think they have to reinvent themselves. It's becoming much more expensive. Alan Rusbridger for The Guardian said he estimated the costs of ensuring communications security for The Guardian were at least £1 million a year already. The need for encryption, which the British government is threatening to make impossible, with, I think, very adverse results for the UK. We have the internet companies threatening, or in some cases actually leaving the UK for other jurisdictions. The US, of course, as you know, has an appeal court has already ruled that the bulk collection of data was unlawful in the US. Congress has enacted a similar a law which takes away some of the powers and relies instead on the data companies, on the telecoms companies holding the data. So for the media, they have to up their game. They have to counter this threat of both state and non-state surveillance of what they do. And they have to become actors in the world debate which is now going on about how to protect both journalism and the safety of journalists. And governments have to adhere, including Western governments which are tempted to take all the powers that they need. They have to remember that international law says three things about restrictions on the press and human rights. It must be lawful, so you need a law to cover it. I'm afraid that wasn't the case in the case of surveillance. It has to be for a legitimate purpose, and in a democracy, and that is a cause for legal challenges which are already taking place in the UK and elsewhere, and it has to be proportionate. And on that proportionality case, many cases have been lost by governments. Final word, because I'm being told to stop. Who uncovered the phone hacking scandal in Britain? The police? No. No, the police hampered that. It was The Guardian and other journalists who did it. So we do need an unfettered press. I think in a venue like this, I probably won't be contested too much in saying that, but the world needs an unfettered and unlovable press. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. It was fascinating, and I would have loved to hear you for much longer. But to give us all a chance to ask a few quick questions, we'll stop here. Yes, the question at the end. Thank you.
Andrew Wood. What is a journalist? The problem now with social media and so on is that a lot of people call themselves journalists. In the past, there were great barriers to entry. If you wanted to be a journalist, you had to work for a magazine or a newspaper or something. Now you can set up a website, you can call yourself a journalist. You don't even have to subscribe to ideas about, which a lot of professional journalists subscribe to, about impartiality, fairness, accuracy, and so on. So isn't it sort of self-defeating, really, to try to defend journalists? Because all you're doing is actually defending anyone who calls themselves a journalist, and that includes a lot of people who we wouldn't perhaps here consider to be journalists, but they might and the law might.
Yeah, well, I guess there are two answers to that. One is that restrictions on freedom of expression exist, hate speech and propaganda. I mean, propaganda of a war is potentially a war crime. So there are limits, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the name of media and journalists has been assumed now by all kinds of enemies of a free press. You see it in a place like Russia, and it's absolutely pernicious. I mean, there's a civil society forum for what they call the European neighbourhood countries, the countries in the shadow of Russia. And the lawyers and media have appealed to journalists around the world to make clear that those who work for propaganda, state-owned or state-directed media in Russia should not be accorded the privileges of journalists. And this is a very awkward one, because if you stop journalists from going in, crossing borders or whatever, it's a can of worms. What I would say is the UK government is one of those which is most vociferous in saying that it is necessary now to expand the understanding and the definition of journalism, the function of journalism, simply because, as I said, social media and the internet have enabled everybody to self-publish. What is at issue in some cases where journalists are taken to court is the issue of publishing information, publishing allegations in good faith. So there is still a test in international law of the ethics of journalism when, if you, for example, in Russia, there's a system of what they call compromat. Compromat is basically powerful people give money to journalists and media. It happens in Bulgaria as well, and they simply smear other people. Now, if a case like that is taken to court, then it would fall. That practice of publication would not be protected, because it would fail the good faith and accuracy test. Oh, and the UN Human Rights Committee has got a very specific paragraph on this. It says, in particular, protections must be given. This is must be given by governments under their obligations under the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights to all those who contribute to the public debate. Journalists, bloggers, human rights defenders, lawyers in certain situations, and so on, and particularly non-government organisations. So you have a whole range of them: the Election Observer, NGOs, Memorial in Russia, etc. They are all covered, and there are also landmark cases in the European Court of Human Rights. Again, this is internationally applicable law, even though it's made in Strasbourg, saying that NGOs can have the same status as media in terms of contributing to the public debate, and they deserve that protection.
Fantastic. I learned a lot, I must say, and I can't believe I didn't know all that, and I think we should all do a bit more of homework about how we are or not protected. Unless there is a very pressing question with... Yes, okay, but quick, please, because we've come up to the time.
Very quickly, can I ask a question, William? Assuming we can define a journalist, and assuming we understand who the fourth estate, what it means, could you just comment very quickly on the state of the law, perhaps in Britain, on the protection of sources? Because you said that with technology and the crushing of machines and so on, it's impossible to protect. But could you just comment very quickly on the state and where you see it's going to develop?
Thanks, because I didn't mention the issue in Britain, which is absolutely acute now. So one of the fallouts from the Snowden revelations is that the Press Gazette and The Guardian and others have asked through the Freedom of Information Act, and they've eventually discovered that in the UK, police in many parts of the country have been secretly accessing the data, the telecoms data, the telephone records of something like 34 journalists 80 journalists in more than 30 cases. And basically what they were trying to do is to expose whistleblowers. There's one, it may not sound important, but this is a very good test case, the so-called Plebgate Affair, a cabinet minister called Andrew Mitchell, who got into an altercation with the police at the gates of number 10. The police wanted to expose who had given away the damning information about their cover-up to the Sun newspaper. And in doing that, they found the names of 3 police who were sacked. They went to court, they were found not guilty, they had not done anything wrong, but they had lost their jobs. And this similar things happened in more than 30 cases. In terms of what happened to the whistleblowers themselves, the sources, the story is rather different. Something like more than 20 of the whistleblowers were found guilty because they had received money for giving away. In each case, I think the public interest was proven, but they were found guilty of having having accepted money. In the case of Edward Snowden, interestingly, who is of course rather an important source, the US law on whistleblowers specifically excludes employees of the security and intelligence services. So otherwise, I think he would have a rather strong public interest defence if he went back to Britain. So the Interception Commissioner. So the UK has a typically unique system of oversight of intelligence and anti-terrorism affairs. Both the independent reviewer of anti-terrorism legislation, David Anderson, he's recently issued a report suggesting quite sweeping reforms to the UK practices, and the Interception Commissioner. The Interception Commissioner did a report in February of this year on the protection of sources and journalistic material, and found that the protections so far under the code of practice in Britain was inadequate. So he's suggested above all, what's necessary is judicial review. So you need a judge's warrant. So this is now going to be a point of dispute in the UK. To what extent the government ministers are prepared to give the authority to courts or to judges in issues of security and intelligence. And the UK has, as traditional, taken an extremely hard line on this. The government, the Guardian, I think, has exposed the alternative argument rather dramatically.
Well, thank you so much for this. Thank you also, Ms. Wilson, for being with us. And just as a token of gratefulness, I'll give you a FCC tie.
Oh, how exciting.